Martin Luther King Jr. was a powerful voice. He spoke about freedom and fairness for Black people in America. He moved many people. But his work also made enemies. One of the biggest was the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the FBI. And its head, J. Edgar Hoover, didn't like King at all. The question is, did the FBI try to blackmail him? The short answer is yes, they did. It was a dark chapter in American history. It shows how far a government agency went to silence a man fighting for civil rights. This story isn't simple. It grew out of fear and power. Hoover saw threats everywhere. He was obsessed with communism. He thought it could destroy America from the inside. When King became famous, Hoover watched him. He looked for any link to communists. The FBI began to follow King. They listened to his calls. They watched his meetings. What they found, they used. Not for national security, but to hurt King personally. They tried to break him. They wanted to make him step down. They wanted to destroy his image. It started slowly, then got worse. The FBI collected private details. They used these details to send a very disturbing letter. This letter told King to kill himself. It said if he didn't, his private life would be exposed. This was not a friendly warning. It was a direct threat. It was a clear attempt to blackmail one of America's most important leaders. And it came from the top of the U.S. government. Martin Luther King Jr. burst onto the national scene in the mid-1950s. He led the Montgomery bus boycott. He was young, charismatic, and a powerful speaker. His message was simple equal rights for Black Americans. He preached nonviolence. He looked to Gandhi for inspiration. His words gave hope to millions. They challenged the deep-seated racism in America. This challenge was huge. It shook the foundation of segregation, but not everyone was happy. Many white leaders in the South hated his message. They saw it as a threat to their way of life. And then there was J. Edgar Hoover. He ran the FBI for decades. Hoover was a powerful man. He had built the FBI into a massive organization. He saw himself as the protector of America. And for Hoover, protection meant fighting anything he saw as a threat. Hoover had a deep fear of communism. He believed communist agents were trying to sneak into American institutions. He saw them trying to turn Americans against their government. This fear shaped his entire career. He used the FBI to hunt down suspected communists. He saw them everywhere. He saw them in labor unions. He saw them in Hollywood. And soon, he started to see them in the civil rights movement. At first, Hoover didn't pay much attention to King, but as King's fame grew, that changed. King was organizing marches, he was leading protests, he was demanding change. To Hoover, such mass movements were suspicious. It looked like the kind of things communists might organize, and King, as a strong Black leader, was a figure Hoover didn't trust. For Hoover, like many powerful white men of his era, had his own prejudices. He wasn't comfortable with Black people gaining power. The FBI's first interest in King wasn't about his private life. It was about communist infiltration. Hoover told his agents to find links between King and the Communist Party, USA. He wanted proof that King was a puppet. He wanted to show that King's fight for civil rights was really a communist plot. This was how Hoover's mind worked. He couldn't imagine a legitimate, homegrown movement for racial equality. To him, it had to be manipulated by outside forces. So, the FBI began its surveillance. They started looking into King's associates, they dug into his past, they wanted to build a case. Not just against King, but against the whole civil rights movement. They wanted to discredit it. They wanted to make people believe it was dangerous. This was the start of a long and ugly campaign. It wasn't about keeping America safe from real enemies. It was about Hoover's own fears and biases. And King, a man of peace, became his target. The stakes were incredibly high. King was fighting for the soul of America. Hoover was using the power of the government to fight against him. This was the battleground. The FBI's hunt for communist links to Martin Luther King Jr. was intense. Hoover was convinced King was either a communist himself or a naive tool for them. This belief wasn't just a hunch, it was an obsession. He pushed his agents hard. He wanted concrete evidence, he wanted to expose King. The FBI focused a lot on two men close to King, Stanley Levison and Jack Odell. Levison was a Jewish lawyer and businessman. He was a trusted advisor to King. He helped King with speeches and fundraising. Levison had past ties to communist circles. Odell was also a Black activist who had some communist affiliations earlier in his life. These past connections were all Hoover needed. To him, they proved his theory. It didn't matter that both men had moved away from active communist organizing. It didn't matter that their advice to King was about civil rights, not revolution. Hoover saw what he wanted to see. Because of these supposed links, the FBI got permission to wiretap King. Robert F. Kennedy was the Attorney General at the time. He was John F. Kennedy's brother. RFK was initially hesitant, but he eventually approved the wiretaps in 1963. He did this for a limited time, only to confirm Levison's alleged communist ties. RFK thought the wiretaps would prove King was clean. He believed King would then be free from suspicion. This was a grave miscalculation. The wiretaps started, and they stayed on King's phones for a long time, much longer than RFK ever intended. What the FBI found, though, wasn't what they expected. They didn't find clear evidence of King being a communist. They didn't find plots to overthrow the government. What they found instead were details about King's personal life. His relationships with women, his conversations with friends, his private thoughts. This was the turning point. The FBI's mission shifted. It went from looking for national security threats to digging for personal dirt. Hoover and his top men realized they had something powerful. Not proof of communist ties, but proof of King's human weaknesses. To Hoover, this was even better. He hated King, he thought King was a hypocrite. He thought King was dangerous. And now, he had information that could destroy King's image. This shift was deeply unethical. The FBI was supposed to protect Americans, not spy on them to find personal flaws. And certainly not to use those flaws to ruin their lives. But Hoover didn't see it that way. He saw King as an enemy. And in his mind, all's fair in war. He saw King as someone who claimed moral authority, but might not live up to it in his private life. This fueled Hoover's animosity. He wanted to expose what he saw as King's hypocrisy. The FBI agents, under Hoover's command, meticulously collected this personal information. They recorded conversations, they wrote down details, they built a massive file on King's private life. This was no longer about communism, it was about character assassination, it was about finding anything that could shame King. Anything that could make people lose faith in him. This was a dark and calculated plan. It was meant to silence King not by argument, but by destruction. With the wiretaps firmly in place, the FBI's focus on Martin Luther King Jr. became laser sharp. Our agents listened day and night. They recorded phone calls in King's hotel rooms, they listened to his conversations with friends, staff, and various women. They weren't finding any communist plots. The grand plan to expose King as a communist puppet never came together. But they were finding something else. They were finding details about King's extramarital affairs. This discovery thrilled J. Edgar Hoover. He saw it as a goldmine. Hoover had a very strict, almost puritanical view of morality. He also held deep prejudices against black men. He viewed King, a prominent black leader, as not just a political opponent, but also a moral degenerate. The private information the wiretaps uncovered fit perfectly into Hoover's preconceived notions about King. He now had what he thought was definitive proof of King's hypocrisy. Hoover gave direct orders. He wanted all this derogatory information compiled, he wanted it organized, he wanted it ready to use. This wasn't about justice or national security anymore. It was about a personal vendetta. Hoover made it clear to his top agents King needed to be destroyed. Not physically, but in terms of his reputation, his standing, and his influence. Hoover wanted King's moral authority shattered. The FBI began creating composite tapes. These tapes were recordings of King's private conversations spliced together to highlight his personal indiscretions. They also wrote detailed reports summarizing everything they had found. This wasn't just intelligence gathering. It was the creation of a weapon. The FBI was preparing to use King's private life against him. They were looking for the perfect moment to strike. Internal FBI documents from this period show a clear intent. They didn't just want to neutralize King, they wanted to destroy him. They wanted to show the American public that their civil rights hero was, in their words, a fraud and a filthy degenerate. They believed that if they could expose King's private life, his public message would collapse. People would stop listening to him. The civil rights movement would lose its most powerful voice. The FBI considered various ways to release this information. They thought about leaking it to the press. They thought about sending it to civil rights organizations. They discussed how to maximize the damage. This was not a passive collection of data, it was an active strategy to undermine a citizen. It was a government agency using its immense power to wage psychological warfare against a private individual, albeit a very public one. Hoover's obsession with King grew stronger. He publicly called King the most notorious liar in the country at a press conference in November 1964. This public attack was a clear sign of the FBI's aggressive posture. It wasn't just Hoover's personal opinion. It was a calculated move. It was meant to soften the ground. It was meant to show that the FBI had something on King. It was a hint of what was to come. The stage was set for the ultimate attempt to crush King. The FBI had gathered its ammunition. Now, they just needed to fire it. This is where the story gets really dark. The FBI had gathered all their information. They had their composite tapes and their detailed reports about Martin Luther King Jr. To Hoover, this was an outrage. How could a man he considered a fraud be honored on the world stage? This pushed him over the edge. So in November 1964, the FBI took its most direct and sickening action. They sent an anonymous letter to King. This letter was later called the suicide letter, or poison pen letter. It was sent to King's office at the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC, in Atlanta. It was then forwarded to his home in early December. The letter was designed to look like it came from within the civil rights movement itself. This was a tactic to make King feel isolated and betrayed. The letter was written by William C. Sullivan. He was an assistant director at the FBI and one of Hoover's top men. He followed Hoover's clear instructions to destroy King. The words in the letter were chilling. They were full of accusations. They called King a filthy, abnormal animal. They accused him of being a colossal fraud and a traitor to all Americans. The letter detailed specific sexual acts and relationships, referring to the FBI's recordings. But the most disturbing part was the threat. The letter writer said that King's filthy, abnormal, fraudulent self would soon be exposed. And then came the stark instruction, King, there is only one thing left for you to do. You know what it is. The clear, unmistakable message was that King should commit suicide. The letter even suggested a deadline, implying that the revelations would come out before the Nobel ceremony. When King and his wife, Coretta Scott King, read the letter, they were horrified. They understood immediately what it meant. Coretta later described it as an attempt to break him, to force him to quit the movement, or worse. King himself recognized it as a desperate effort to discredit him. He eventually concluded that only the FBI could have sent such a letter, given the specific and intimate details it contained. This letter was not a subtle hint. It was a direct, brutal attempt at psychological blackmail. The FBI used information gathered through illegal wiretaps. They weaponized King's personal life. Their goal was to make him so distraught, so ashamed, that he would either withdraw from public life or take his own life. This was not just harassment, it was an attempt to destroy the man and silence his movement through emotional and psychological terror. The letter didn't work the way the FBI wanted. King didn't kill himself, he didn't step down. He went to Oslo and accepted his Nobel Peace Prize. But the letter deeply affected him. It caused him immense distress. He knew the depths of the government's animosity. He knew they were willing to go to extreme lengths. This act showed the true face of the FBI's campaign against him. It was a campaign not of justice, but of malice. It was a blatant attempt at blackmail, orchestrated by the highest levels of American law enforcement. Martin Luther King Jr. did not give in to the FBI's blackmail attempt. He was shaken by the poison pen letter, but he pushed forward. He went to Oslo and accepted the Nobel Peace Prize. He continued his work for civil rights. The FBI's campaign didn't stop, though. They kept up their surveillance and their efforts to discredit him right up until his assassination in 1968. They tried to spread the derogatory information to journalists and government officials, hoping someone else would publish it. But for the most part, the press held back. The public remained unaware of the full extent of the FBI's actions. The full truth about the FBI's blackmail attempt and its broader campaign against King didn't come out for many years. It was hidden by secrecy and power. After Hoover's death in 1972, things slowly began to change. More information started to surface. The Freedom of Information Act, FOIA, allowed researchers to request government documents. These requests started to chip away at the secrecy. The biggest revelations came in the mid-1970s. The U.S. Senate formed the Church Committee. Senator Frank Church led it. This committee was tasked with investigating abuses by U.S. intelligence agencies, including the FBI and the CIA. The Church Committee dug deep into the FBI's COINTELPRO program. This program was a series of covert and often illegal projects aimed at surveying, infiltrating, discrediting, and disrupting domestic political organizations. Martin Luther King Jr. was a prime target of COINTELPRO. The Church Committee's findings were shocking. They laid bare the FBI's extensive surveillance of King. They exposed the illegal wiretaps. And most importantly, they revealed the anonymous suicide letter. The committee detailed how the FBI used the information it gathered to try and force King out of public life. They explicitly called it an attempt to discredit and neutralize him. The public finally learned the disturbing truth. Their government, through the FBI, had tried to destroy one of its most important moral leaders. The reaction was one of outrage and disbelief. How could the FBI, an agency sworn to uphold the law, engage in such a campaign? It exposed a dark side of government power. It showed how easily that power could be abused. It highlighted the dangers of unchecked authority. This wasn't just about King, it was about the rights of all Americans. If the FBI could do this to a Nobel Peace Prize winner, what could they do to anyone? The legacy of this episode is profound. It left a lasting stain on the FBI's reputation. It led to reforms and new rules designed to prevent such abuses from happening again. It sparked a crucial debate about government surveillance, privacy, and civil liberties. It showed that even a beloved figure like King was not immune to the ruthless tactics of a powerful, paranoid government agency. Looking back, the answer to the question, did the FBI try to blackmail Martin Luther King Jr., is an undeniable yes. They collected deeply personal and private information. They compiled it with malicious intent. They used it to send an anonymous letter directly threatening to expose him and urging him to take his own life. This was a clear, calculated act of blackmail. It was meant to silence a man who spoke truth to power. It was a shameful chapter in American history, but one that must be remembered so that such abuses are never repeated. It stands as a stark reminder of the constant need to guard against government overreach and to protect the freedoms for which Martin Luther King Jr. so bravely fought.